The quickest way to discover who truly built a company is to watch where every eye turns when everything changes. Victoria Bennett stepped out of the black executive sedan expecting another ordinary morning. But the moment her polished heels touched the marble entrance outside Bennett Dynamics, something impossible happened. Nearly every employee standing along the front walkway straightened at the same time. Engineers stopped their conversations. Department managers lowered their coffee cups. Security officers smiled. Reception staff stood from behind the welcome desk. Then, almost in perfect unison, voices echoed across the spacious lobby. "Good morning, boss." Victoria offered a professional smile, believing the greeting was meant for her, as it had been every weekday since becoming chief executive officer 3 years earlier. She nodded politely while walking toward the revolving glass doors, but after only 2 steps, she noticed something that instantly stopped her. Nobody was looking at her. Every face remained fixed on someone walking quietly several feet behind her. Victoria slowly turned around. Ethan Walker, wearing faded blue jeans, clean work boots, and a simple gray jacket, stood frozen near the entrance with one hand resting on the shoulder of his 8-year-old daughter, Lily. He looked just as confused as everyone else. Lily squeezed her father's hand and whispered, "Daddy, are they talking to you?" Ethan smiled awkwardly. "I honestly do not know." Before he could take another step, the senior maintenance director hurried across the lobby with a wide smile. "Good morning, boss," he repeated warmly before extending both hands toward Ethan. "It is wonderful to finally see you back." Another engineering manager quickly followed. "We have been waiting for you." Within seconds, more employees surrounded Ethan, greeting him with genuine respect instead of corporate formality. Nobody appeared instructed. Nobody seemed rehearsed. The admiration felt natural, almost instinctive. Victoria remained standing in complete silence, trying to understand why the people who usually greeted her first had suddenly gathered around the quiet single father she barely knew. Ethan looked uncomfortable rather than proud. "Please," he said gently. "I think there is some misunderstanding." An older systems engineer laughed softly. "No misunderstanding at all. Some titles come from contracts. Others come from earning everyone's respect." Victoria studied Ethan more carefully than ever before. Less than 12 hours earlier, she had spent an unexpected night inside his modest suburban home after a violent thunderstorm flooded the highways and left her unable to reach the city safely. She had shared a simple homemade dinner with Ethan and Lily, slept in the guest room, and left early that morning believing she understood everything about the quiet father who repaired bicycles after dinner and never mentioned his work unless someone asked. Yet standing inside her own company, surrounded by employees who clearly knew something she did not, Victoria realized she had only seen a tiny part of his life. The revolving doors opened again as another group of veteran engineers entered the lobby carrying laptops and rolled technical drawings. The moment they noticed Ethan, every one of them smiled. One after another, they greeted him with the exact same word. "Morning, boss." Victoria looked from one familiar face to another, searching for an explanation, but nobody seemed surprised except her. Then the chief technology officer hurried across the lobby carrying a thick folder marked confidential. He stopped directly before Ethan instead of the chief executive officer and quietly said, "We have a serious systems emergency upstairs. We have been hoping you would come back today." 20 hours earlier, dark storm clouds swallowed the evening sky above the quiet suburbs outside the city, while heavy rain transformed familiar streets into slow-moving rivers of water. Victoria Bennett tightened her grip on the steering wheel as windshield wipers struggled to keep pace with the relentless downpour. Every navigation app on her phone displayed the same warning. Major highways were closed. Secondary roads were flooded. Cell service faded with every passing mile until even the digital map disappeared. She let out a quiet breath and carefully guided the luxury sedan toward the nearest residential neighborhood, where porch lights still glowed through sheets of rain. Several blocks away, Ethan Walker had just finished washing dinner dishes while his 8-year-old daughter Lily sat at the kitchen table coloring a picture of the 3 of them standing beneath a bright rainbow. Their small home felt warm despite the storm outside. Fresh bread cooled on the counter, while soft music played quietly from an old radio. Ethan glanced toward the window as another flash of lightning illuminated the street. Moments later, Lily noticed headlights stopping outside their driveway. "Daddy, someone is here," she said. Ethan looked through the curtains and saw a dark sedan surrounded by rising water near the curb. He immediately grabbed an umbrella. "Stay inside until I come back," he said gently. Before he reached the front door, Lily was already standing beside him holding a second towel. Outside, Victoria stepped from the vehicle only after realizing the water had risen above her shoes. The wind instantly soaked her business suit despite the umbrella she carried. Ethan approached with calm concern rather than curiosity. "Are you all right?" he asked. Victoria recognized him immediately. He occasionally worked on technical projects for Bennett Dynamics, though they had spoken only briefly during company meetings. "The roads disappeared faster than I expected," she admitted. "My phone has almost no signal." Ethan looked toward the flooded intersection. "You should not keep driving tonight." Victoria hesitated. She had negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts without hesitation, yet accepting help from an employee felt strangely uncomfortable. Before she could answer, Lily stepped forward with innocent confidence. "You can stay with us until the rain stops," she said with a warm smile. Ethan looked at his daughter before turning back toward Victoria. "The guest room is simple," he said, "but it is dry, warm, and safe." Victoria smiled politely. "I do not want to inconvenience your family." Lily shook her head immediately. "Daddy always says neighbors help. Neighbors before strangers become friends." Ethan laughed softly. "She remembers everything I say." A few minutes later, Victoria entered the modest home and quietly removed her rain-soaked jacket near the front door. The warmth inside surprised her. Family photographs covered one wall. Children's drawings decorated the refrigerator. A repaired bicycle rested neatly beside a small workbench in the garage. Nothing appeared expensive, yet everything reflected patience, care, and quiet love. During dinner, Lily eagerly described school projects while Ethan listened with complete attention, asking thoughtful questions instead of checking emails or answering business calls. Victoria realized she could not remember the last uninterrupted family meal she had experienced. Later that evening, after Lily had gone to bed, Ethan prepared fresh blankets in the guest room without asking for anything in return. As Victoria thanked him, her eyes wandered toward the partially open door of his home office where neatly organized technical drawings, system architecture diagrams, and thick engineering binders covered every shelf. Something about those documents looked strangely familiar, but before she could take a closer look, another clap of thunder echoed outside, quietly beginning a night that would change both of their lives forever. After making certain Victoria Bennett had everything she needed, Ethan Walker quietly returned to the small home office at the end of the hallway. He believed his unexpected guest had already gone to sleep, so he switched on a single desk lamp instead of the brighter ceiling light and sat before an aging computer surrounded by carefully organized binders. The room reflected years of patient work rather than expensive equipment. Handwritten notes filled the edges of system diagrams. Whiteboards displayed flowcharts connected by neat lines and color markers. Shelves held dozens of labeled notebooks arranged by project and year. Ethan opened a large technical drawing across his desk and slowly reviewed several handwritten corrections before updating another engineering diagram. He worked with the calm rhythm of someone who valued precision more than recognition. Down the hallway, Victoria remained awake despite the comforting silence surrounding the house. The unfamiliar warmth of a real family home contrasted sharply with the luxury penthouse she usually returned to after exhausting business days. She quietly stepped into the hallway, intending only to find a glass of water, but the soft light escaping beneath the office door caught her attention. She gently approached and noticed the door standing slightly open. Without making a sound, she glanced inside. Spread across Ethan's desk were architectural system maps, software infrastructure diagrams, emergency recovery flowcharts, and operational frameworks that looked astonishingly familiar. Victoria frowned slightly. She had seen nearly identical structures inside Bennett Dynamics countless times during executive presentations. Curious, she looked closer without entering the room. One binder carried a handwritten label reading Original Core Architecture. Another read Operational Continuity Framework. Several pages displayed dates reaching back nearly 10 years, long before she became Chief Executive Officer. Ethan quietly compared one diagram against another before making a careful revision in blue ink. He never noticed Victoria standing just outside the doorway. She recognized several internal process names unique to her own company, yet she could not understand why those documents existed inside a modest suburban home instead of the secure corporate archive. Before she could study another page, Lily quietly appeared beside her wearing soft pajamas and carrying a favorite stuffed rabbit. "Sometimes Daddy cannot sleep until he solves every puzzle," she whispered with an innocent smile. Victoria smiled gently. "Does he always work this late?" Lily nodded proudly. "He says people at work should never have to guess what comes next." Victoria looked back toward the office, watching Ethan patiently rewrite another page by hand. "Does he ever tell you about his job?" Lily shook her head. "He says work stays at work. Home is for family." Those simple words lingered in Victoria's mind. She had spent years bringing corporate pressure home every evening, answering messages through dinner and measuring life by quarterly reports. Standing inside Ethan's quiet home, she suddenly realized that success could look very different from everything she had believed. She thanked Lily softly before returning to the guest room. Rain continued tapping gently against the windows while distant thunder faded beyond the neighborhood. Just before turning off the bedside lamp, Victoria looked once more toward the hallway where the faint office light still glowed beneath the door. She could not explain why those engineering diagrams seemed so familiar, but one feeling stayed with her as she finally closed her eyes. Somewhere inside that quiet room, hidden among ordinary notebooks and carefully folded blueprints, rested a truth about Bennett Dynamics that no executive meeting had ever revealed, and by sunrise that hidden truth would begin changing everything she thought she knew about the quiet single father sleeping under the same roof. Morning sunlight finally broke through the retreating storm clouds as Victoria Bennett thanked Ethan Walker for his kindness and prepared to leave. Lily handed her a neatly folded paper napkin holding 2 homemade blueberry muffins. "One for breakfast and one for later," she said with a cheerful smile. Victoria accepted the small gift with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Lily. They look wonderful." Ethan walked them to the front door before checking the street outside. The floodwater had receded enough for traffic to move safely again. "The road should be clear now," he said. "Drive carefully. Victoria Nadif. Thank you for everything. I hope I can return the favor someday." Ethan smiled politely. "You already did." Lily enjoyed having a guest. As Victoria drove toward Bennett Dynamics, she found herself thinking less about the approaching executive meetings and more about the quiet office she had seen inside Ethan's modest home. The technical drawings, handwritten notes, and carefully labeled binders refused to leave her mind. By the time she arrived at company headquarters, the unusual feeling had only grown stronger. Meanwhile, Ethan drove Lily to school before continuing toward the office in his older pickup truck. The routine felt no different from any other weekday. He waved goodbye as Lily ran toward the school entrance carrying her backpack. "Have a wonderful day, Daddy." "You too, sweetheart." Less than 30 minutes later, both Ethan and Victoria reached Bennett Dynamics from opposite sides of the city. Before either of them had time to settle into the morning, alarms suddenly echoed through multiple departments. Large display screens across the building flashed unexpected system notifications. Engineering dashboards disconnected one after another. Internal communication software stopped responding. Manufacturing schedules disappeared from planning terminals. Managers hurried through hallways carrying laptops, while support teams attempted emergency diagnostics. Inside the executive conference room, the chief technology officer looked visibly concerned. "The operational backbone is failing across every division," he reported. "Several core services stopped communicating with each other just after 8 o'clock. Victoria immediately asked, "Restore the backup environment." The answer came almost instantly. "We already tried. The backup references the same architecture." Another engineer added, "Every recovery script ends at the same protected framework. None of us can safely move beyond that point." Victoria stared at the complex system map projected across the wall. Something about its layered structure looked strangely familiar. Then an unexpected memory returned. The handwritten diagrams inside Ethan's office. The identical flow patterns. The same framework names. Before she could speak, the senior infrastructure manager entered carrying several aging binders retrieved from the company archive. "We found the original architecture documentation," he announced. He opened the first binder across the conference table. Victoria leaned forward. Her eyes widened. The diagrams matched what she had seen only hours earlier inside Ethan's home. Even the handwritten annotations looked almost identical. "Who designed this?" she asked quietly. The room fell silent. The manager hesitated before answering. The original architect never stayed in executive leadership, but nearly everyone who worked here during the early years still remembers him. Victoria slowly looked around the room. "Who?" Before anyone could answer, another emergency alert appeared across every display. The operational network entered restricted protection mode, automatically rejecting every recovery command. The chief technology officer took a slow breath before saying the one sentence nobody inside the executive conference room expected to hear. "There's only one person who fully understands the original architecture well enough to restart the system without risking permanent damage, and he just walked into the building with his daughter less than 15 minutes ago." Victoria Bennett did not hesitate another second. "Find Ethan Walker immediately," she ordered as executives hurried from the conference room in every direction. Throughout the headquarters, employees rushed between departments while warning messages continued appearing across monitors. Despite the growing pressure, Ethan remained completely unaware of the crisis. He had already reached a quiet engineering workspace where he was reviewing several maintenance reports left on his desk earlier that morning. He greeted coworkers with the same calm smile he offered every day before sitting down with a notebook filled with handwritten observations. A few moments later, the chief technology officer entered the room almost out of breath. "Ethan, we need your help." Ethan looked up calmly. "What happened?" The operational architecture entered protected recovery mode. Every automated restoration attempt has failed. Ethan closed his notebook and stood without showing panic. "Has anyone modified the authorization framework?" The chief technology officer exchanged a quick glance with another engineer. "A security update was approved late yesterday." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then the recovery sequence probably rejected the new authentication pathway." One younger engineer frowned. "How did you know that?" Ethan simply replied, "Because I designed the protection logic to reject any mismatch before it could damage live operations." Those words left the room completely silent. Before anyone spoke again, Victoria arrived outside the engineering office. She stopped briefly at the doorway, watching Ethan quietly answer technical questions from engineers who clearly trusted every word he said. The confidence surrounding him looked nothing like the reserved employee she believed she knew. "Mr. Walker," Victoria said respectfully, "would you come with us?" Ethan looked at her expression and immediately understood the seriousness of the situation. "Of course." As they walked toward the executive operations center together, employees along the hallway stepped aside almost instinctively. Some nodded respectfully. Others quietly smiled. Several senior engineers greeted him with the same unexpected title Victoria had already heard that morning. "Morning, boss." Ethan answered every greeting exactly the same way. "Good morning." He never corrected them, yet he never encouraged the title either. Inside the Executive Operations Center, enormous display walls showed cascading system alerts across manufacturing, logistics, purchasing, scheduling, and quality control. Ethan studied the screens without speaking for nearly a full minute. Then he asked one simple question. "Who approved last night's security synchronization?" A systems administrator quietly raised his hand. "I did, based on the automatic recommendation." Ethan nodded without criticism. You followed procedure. The recommendation was incomplete. He walked toward the central architecture display and requested the original framework map. When it appeared, Victoria immediately recognized the same structure she had seen inside Ethan's home only hours earlier. Ethan pointed calmly toward one section highlighted in red. The recovery engine is not broken. It is protecting itself. An executive looked confused. Can we bypass it? Ethan immediately shook his head. Absolutely not. If we force the restart, every linked operational dependency could lose synchronization. The protection exists because I wanted the company to survive mistakes instead of hiding them. Victoria quietly asked, "Can you restore everything?" Ethan looked at the screens for another thoughtful moment before answering. Yes, but first, I need everyone to stop trying to fix it. Sometimes the fastest solution begins by allowing the system to become quiet. The room fell completely silent as every engineer slowly stepped away from their keyboards, placing their trust in the man whose name had never appeared on the organizational chart, yet whose knowledge had quietly supported the entire company for years. No one touched a keyboard after Ethan Walker spoke. The Executive Operations Center, normally filled with constant conversations and ringing phones, became remarkably still. Hundreds of status indicators continued flashing across the massive display wall, yet every engineer kept their hands away from the controls exactly as instructed. Ethan slowly walked toward the primary system console without any sign of urgency. He placed his notebook beside the keyboard and carefully studied the live architecture diagram projected across the largest screen. The system is behaving exactly as it should, he said quietly. Several executives exchanged puzzled looks. Victoria Bennett stepped closer. It does not look healthy. Ethan smiled gently. Healthy systems protect themselves before they protect productivity. He pointed toward a blinking authorization gateway. This framework compares every security update against the original operational blueprint before allowing access. Last night's synchronization introduced a new authentication sequence, but nobody updated the trust relationship inside the foundation layer. The chief technology officer looked surprised. Can we simply add the missing authorization? Ethan slowly shook his head. Not while the system is actively defending itself. We have to earn its trust again. He requested access to the original architecture repository. Within seconds, several archived design documents appeared on the display. Victoria immediately recognized the same organization, formatting, handwritten revision notes, and recovery flowcharts she had quietly observed inside Ethan's home office. Every page reflected extraordinary attention to detail. Ethan opened one recovery sequence and calmly explained every step before selecting a single verification command. The warning indicators across one division immediately changed from flashing red to steady yellow. A young systems engineer stared at the display. We have been trying for almost 2 hours. You changed one verification pathway. Ethan answered with his usual humility. The system was never asking for a repair. It was asking whether it could still trust the people making changes. He invited the younger engineer to sit beside him. You will complete the remaining recovery. The engineer looked nervous. I have never done this before. Ethan nodded encouragingly. That is why the documentation exists. Together, they followed every recovery instruction exactly as written. No shortcuts, no assumptions. Every confirmation matched the original architecture. One department after another gradually returned to normal operation. Communication servers reconnected. Manufacturing schedules reappeared. Inventory synchronization resumed. Logistics dashboards refreshed automatically. Green confirmation lights slowly replaced warning messages across the enormous display wall. Soft applause began somewhere behind the engineering team before spreading throughout the operations center. Ethan never celebrated. Instead, he quietly asked the young engineer, "What did you learn?" The engineer smiled with growing confidence. The documentation was not slowing us down. It was protecting us from rushing. Ethan nodded. Exactly. Victoria watched the exchange in complete silence. She realized Ethan could easily have restored everything alone in minutes. Yet he deliberately chose to teach someone else instead of demonstrating personal brilliance. The lead infrastructure manager then opened an archived personnel record that had remained untouched for years. He looked toward Victoria before speaking carefully. Chief Executive Officer, there is something you deserve to know. Every core operational framework, every emergency recovery sequence, every documentation standard, and every protected architecture layer still guiding this company today was originally designed by Ethan Walker during our startup years. Most of us never stopped calling him boss because long before executive titles existed, he was the person who taught us how this company should think. Victoria slowly turned toward Ethan, finally understanding why every greeting that morning had carried respect rather than protocol, and why the quiet father who had offered her a simple guest room possessed an authority no organizational chart could ever create. The applause inside the executive operations center continued for several moments before slowly fading into respectful silence. Nobody hurried back to their desks. Nobody rushed toward the elevators. Instead, employees remained exactly where they stood, watching Ethan Walker close the architecture documents and quietly thank the young engineer who had completed the recovery sequence beside him. "You did the work," Ethan said with a warm smile. "The system simply needed someone willing to listen." The young engineer shook his head. "You trusted me before I trusted myself," Ethan gently replied. "That is how every good teacher begins." Victoria Bennett absorbed every word without speaking. During years of leading Bennett Dynamics, she had seen brilliant executives, persuasive consultants, and talented engineers, but she had never witnessed someone earn respect so naturally without asking for recognition. The title everyone had used that morning suddenly made perfect sense. It had never described authority over people. It described responsibility for them. The chief technology officer stepped forward, carrying a worn leather portfolio retrieved from the company archives. "Chief Executive Officer," he said respectfully, "there's one more record you should see." He carefully opened the portfolio on the conference table. Inside rested the earliest organizational planning documents from the company's startup years. Original engineering strategies, initial operational frameworks, long-term technology roadmaps. Every document listed the same principal architect, Ethan Walker. Victoria slowly turned each page. She found handwritten notes explaining why every department should communicate through transparent documentation instead of personal influence. Another page described leadership as service rather than control. A third outlined emergency recovery principles almost identical to the procedures that had restored the company only minutes earlier. She looked up quietly. "Why did you never tell anyone?" Ethan answered honestly. "Because the work mattered more than my name." One senior manufacturing director smiled. "That answer is exactly why nobody here ever forgot who built the foundation." Another department manager nodded. When the company was small, Ethan trained every engineering team personally. He stayed late helping new employees understand the systems instead of trying to impress investors. Most of us learned our jobs directly from him. Victoria listened as one veteran employee after another shared similar memories. Every story described the same quiet generosity. Every success traced back to the same patient mentor. None of those achievements had ever appeared in executive presentations. None had been mentioned during board meetings. Yet they remained alive inside the people Ethan had helped. The executive conference room doors opened as additional employees gathered outside after hearing the operational crisis had been resolved. When Ethan stepped into the hallway, conversations immediately stopped. One experienced technician smiled and raised a hand. "Morning, boss." Another voice echoed the greeting. Then another. Within seconds, the hallway filled with warm, genuine voices. "Good morning, boss. Glad to see you. Welcome back." The greetings spread naturally across the floor until nearly every employee nearby shared the same expression of gratitude. Ethan acknowledged each person with simple kindness, greeting everyone by name whenever he could. Victoria watched the scene with quiet humility. She finally understood that real leadership could never be granted through contracts, promoted through titles, or protected by executive offices. It was built one act of service at a time until other people willingly carried that respect forward. As the hallway slowly emptied and normal business resumed, Victoria made one silent promise to herself. Before another day ended, she would discover exactly why the man everyone called boss had disappeared from the leadership history of the very company he had quietly helped create. Victoria Bennett spent the remainder of the afternoon inside the secure corporate archive, requesting every surviving document connected to Bennett Dynamics during its earliest years. Dust-covered storage boxes gradually filled the long conference table as records, engineering journals, handwritten planning binders, meeting minutes, and organizational charts were carefully arranged before her. She expected to discover one forgotten promotion or an overlooked project. Instead, she uncovered an entirely different history. Every major operational breakthrough carried Ethan Walker's handwriting. Every emergency planning guide contained his careful annotations. Every engineering framework that continued supporting the company had originally been designed by the quiet single father who still arrived every morning in an aging pickup truck and spent evenings helping his daughter with homework. Yet somewhere around the company's rapid expansion, his name slowly disappeared from executive reports while his work remained at the center of every successful department. Victoria continued reading until she reached an old board memorandum that finally explained everything. Years earlier, outside investors had demanded a leadership structure built around executives with aggressive corporate profiles. Ethan had been offered a senior executive position, but declined after explaining that he preferred solving problems rather than managing politics. Another executive accepted the title, while quietly presenting Ethan's operational frameworks as collective departmental achievements. Ethan never challenged the decision. He simply continued improving the systems, because he believed the company's future mattered more than personal recognition. Victoria slowly closed the document and remained silent for several moments. The truth felt heavier than any financial report she had ever reviewed. She quietly asked the corporate archivist, "Did he ever complain?" The elderly archivist smiled gently. "Never once. He always said that if the systems helped people succeed, the work had already received its reward." Victoria lowered her eyes, remembering the simple dinner table inside Ethan's home, the warmth Lily brought into every conversation, and the peaceful confidence Ethan carried without asking anyone to admire him. She realized she had met a man who measured success by completely different standards than the corporate world around him. Early the next morning, before regular business hours began, Victoria invited every department director, executive manager, engineering supervisor, and board representative to the main assembly hall. Employees quietly filled the room, uncertain why an emergency company meeting had been scheduled after the previous day's crisis. Ethan arrived expecting another technical review and chose a seat near the back beside several engineers. Victoria stepped onto the stage, carrying only one folder. She looked across the room before speaking. "Yesterday, I learned something that should have been understood years ago." The hall became completely silent. This company was built upon extraordinary leadership that never asked for applause. We accepted the systems, the stability, the documentation, and the culture of excellence without properly honoring the person who created them. She paused before looking directly toward Ethan. "Mr. Walker, would you please join me on stage?" Ethan hesitated, visibly uncomfortable with becoming the center of attention. Several long-time employees smiled encouragingly until he slowly walked forward. Victoria waited until he stood beside her before continuing. "Today I am correcting a mistake that should never have existed." She opened the folder and revealed a newly signed executive resolution restoring Ethan as the official founding chief systems architect, recognizing his authorship, leadership, and permanent place in the company's history. The room erupted into heartfelt applause, but Ethan looked only toward the audience where countless familiar faces smiled with quiet pride, realizing this recognition had never been about changing who he was. It was finally allowing the truth to stand beside the man who had carried it alone for so many years. 1 year later, Bennett Dynamics looked like a different company. Not because the buildings had changed, but because the people inside them had learned a new definition of leadership. Every engineering document, every operational framework, every recovery procedure, and every training manual now carried complete authorship beneath the company logo. At the top of the first page appeared the same name that had quietly shaped the organization from the beginning: Ethan Walker. New employees no longer discovered his contribution through rumors or old stories. They learned it on their very first day. Victoria Bennett personally introduced every orientation class with the same message: never confuse the loudest voice with the strongest foundation. This company stands because someone chose service before recognition. Ethan accepted his restored position with the same humility that had guided him for years. He refused a private executive office and instead continued working beside engineers, technicians, and documentation specialists. Every afternoon, he invited younger employees to ask questions, believing knowledge became more valuable each time it was shared. Whenever someone thanked him for building the company's operational backbone, he always smiled and replied, "A system only succeeds when every person improves it together." His words gradually became part of the company's culture. Victoria also changed in ways that surprised everyone around her. She spent less time speaking during meetings and more time listening. Before approving any major decision, she visited the engineering floor to hear directly from the people responsible for the work. Employees who had once feared entering the executive office now found its door open throughout the day. Respect replaced distance. Collaboration replaced pride. One Friday afternoon, Lily visited headquarters after school, carrying a handmade thank you card for everyone who had helped her father. Engineers gathered around her with warm smiles while she proudly walked through the same lobby where, 1 year earlier, employees had first greeted Ethan as boss. Looking around the busy building, she quietly asked, "Daddy, why do they still call you boss if you are not the chief executive officer?" Ethan knelt beside her with a gentle smile. "Because they're not talking about a job title. They're talking about taking care of people." Victoria happened to hear his answer while walking nearby. She smiled softly before joining them. "Your father taught all of us that lesson," she said. Lily slipped her small hand into Ethan's and looked up at Victoria. "Then maybe everybody can become a boss if they help enough people." Victoria laughed warmly. "I think you may be exactly right." As the three of them stood together near the large windows overlooking the thriving campus, employees continued greeting Ethan with genuine respect, yet he greeted every person exactly the same way, by remembering their names before they ever spoke his. In that simple habit, Victoria finally understood the reason the entire company had instinctively called him boss. It was never because he held authority over others. It was because he had spent years quietly lifting others higher than himself. The company had recovered its forgotten history. Ethan had regained the recognition he never demanded. Victoria had become the leader she truly wanted to be, and Lily watched the two adults she admired most smiling together with growing trust and quiet affection. Sometimes the strongest foundations are not built from steel, technology, or impressive titles. Sometimes they are built by one humble father whose greatest achievement is leaving every person better than he found them, proving that real leadership begins with kindness, earns respect through service, and lasts far longer than any position ever could.